The first day of the new semester was supposed to be uneventful for Renji Kazuki. Just another year, another syllabus, another weary trudge through academia. He was already calculating how many weeks until midterms when the professor, with a tone far too chipper for 9 a.m., made an announcement that immediately set Renji's nerves on fire. Class, for this semester's core project, you'll be working in pairs. Assigned, not chosen, the professor said, glancing up with a smile that felt like a warning. Treat this like soul bonding, academic soulmates. Renji froze. Soul? What? The roll call began. Names read off like fate being dispensed. His fingers clenched around his pen the moment he heard it. Kazuki Renji and Saito Kaworu. The classroom erupted into a quiet murmur. Chairs creaked, a few students gasped, and then it happened. A soft, inexplicable flash of purple light shimmered around Renji and Kaworu's desks. It wasn't bright, just barely there, like the afterglow of static electricity, but it was real enough to elicit a low, eerie purr from Mochi, the department's mysteriously ever-present cat, curled on the windowsill. The feline's eyes opened momentarily, glowing like embers in the dark, before it settled back down. Kaworu's Saito, who had been leaning back in his chair with the casual disinterest of someone who already knew what grade he'd get, turned toward Renji and gave him a slow, languid smirk. "Hey partner," he said. That was it. 2 words, but Renji's ears were ringing. The sheer gall, the audacity, that smirk, like Kaworu had waited his whole life for this moment just to torment him. His black hair shimmered like ink in the sunlight, and his voice carried that maddening tone of lazy amusement, the kind that made Renji's blood rise with instantaneous loathing. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Inside, he was combusting. Renji, the top student in every class since junior year, who survived high school entrance exams with a 98th percentile ranking, now had to share his project. No, his intellectual integrity, with the one person who had been a persistent thorn in his academic side since freshman year. Kaworu was smart, yes, but he was the kind of smart that didn't try. He barely showed up to lectures and still managed to outscore Renji on tests, turning in assignments minutes before the deadline with the confidence of someone immune to consequence. That smirk haunted Renji, not because it was cruel, but because it was so maddeningly effortless. Kaworu didn't compete, he just existed in the same space, infuriatingly unbothered, as if excellence were something he breathed in through the air. The husbands, someone whispered from the back of the classroom. Renji's head jerked up, the whisper turned into a giggle, then a full chorus of teasing voices. Oh my God, it's them. The purple light, did you see that? It's fate. Academic fate. They're totally soulbound. The husbands, a girl repeated, louder this time. And just like that, the name stuck. Renji looked at the professor in mute horror, expecting, hoping, that they would shut it down, correct the students, something. But no, the professor grinned, entirely too pleased. Well, they said, closing the attendance list, if the spiritual binding glows for a pair, who am I to argue? Kazuki Saito, looks like this partnership was meant to be. Another wave of soft laughter rolled through the classroom, but to Renji, it felt like static crackling on his skin. Kaworu, of course, was unbothered. He leaned toward Renji, elbows on the desk, his chin resting lazily in his palm. Looks like we're academic soulmates now, he said, his voice low enough for only Renji to hear. Don't worry, I'll carry the marriage if you can't handle the pressure. Renji's face burned. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. He gripped his pen like a weapon. I hate you, he muttered. But the words sounded small, breathless. Kaworu blinked, mock-injured. So cold, Renji. You're going to have to warm up if this marriage is going to last. There it was again, the ease, the effortless superiority, and now, this public humiliation disguised as banter. The entire classroom had turned into a stage for Kaworu's performance, and Renji, unwillingly cast as the reluctant partner, had no script to defend himself. The worst part, Kaworu wasn't being mean, he was being playful. That made it humiliating in a completely different way, because everyone else laughed with Kaworu, not at Renji. Mochi purred again, louder this time, tail flicking once before it closed its glowing eyes, a knowing sound, too aware. The professor began to pass out project outlines, but Renji's mind was spiraling. He had seen enough anime to know how this looked. Two rivals, fated to collaborate, bound by something unexplainable, an aura of purple, a nickname like the husband's. This wasn't just embarrassment, it was narrative sabotage, and Kaworu, he was leaning back in his chair again, arms folded behind his head, already in full command of the story. Renji had studied too hard, too long, to be upstaged by someone who didn't even try. He would not be the lesser half of the husbands, not without a fight, but for now, all he could do was sit, still, silent, burning, while the entire classroom watched the scene unfold, like the first episode of a new drama. And Kaworu just smirked again, like he was enjoying this, like he wanted Renji to squirm. Like he had already won. Renji stood in front of the apartment door longer than necessary, hesitating not because he was nervous, or so he told himself, but because he had to mentally recalibrate. Kaworu Saito's apartment was in a part of the city Renji didn't usually go to, with sleek stairwells and frosted glass lobby doors. He had imagined something more, unhinged, broken bricks, a rusted gate, something that made sense for a man who treated academics like a sport, and had been described by their classmates as haunted by beautiful ghosts. He knocked. Kaworu opened the door with a wry smile that made Renji immediately regret knocking at all. "You came," Kaworu said, stepping aside, motioning him in with a flick of his wrist. "Hope you brought your soul-bonding energy." "I brought my laptop," Renji replied dryly. He stepped in, prepared for cobwebs, and maybe a suspicious jar in the kitchen labeled teeth. What he saw instead short-circuited his brain. Warm amber lighting glowed from a low vintage lamp on the side table. Colorful throw pillows spilled across a well-used couch, a bookshelf teetered with paperbacks and old manga volumes. A soft jazz record played somewhere in the background, the needle scratching slightly between tracks. The scent of something floral, maybe chamomile, hung in the air, and the curtains weren't heavy gothic velvet, but cheerful cotton printed with abstract sunshapes. A cat stared up at Renji from the hallway, a fat white cat with mismatched eyes. "Expecting a crypt?" Kaworu asked, strolling past him and tossing his keys onto the kitchen counter. "Yes," Renji replied without thinking. Kaworu laughed, not insulted in the slightest. "Sorry to disappoint. Turns out I live like an emotionally stable ghost." Renji's bag slipped off his shoulder as he stepped cautiously into the living room, eyes still darting around, like something sinister was going to spring out from behind the comfy-looking chair. The cat followed him silently. "Mochi," Kaworu said with a nod. "She usually hates strangers, but she seems to like you." Mochi brushed against Renji's shin and purred, which didn't help the sense of unreality that was rapidly overtaking him. He watched her settle neatly on the couch cushion, pawing a bright yellow pillow into place, before curling up into a perfect circle. Kaworu was already setting down notebooks on the coffee table like this wasn't a hostage situation. Renji, feeling like he was being psychologically pranked, reluctantly sat down next to the cat. Mochi pressed against his side. Kaworu settled onto the floor across from him, and leaned back on his palms. "I figured we could start with outlining the theory framework, before you spiral into thesis mode, and scare off the entire group." Renji bristled. "I don't spiral." "You absolutely spiral," Kaworu said, reaching for a pen. "You once wrote a 30-page response to a single discussion prompt. The professor thought it was a prank essay. It wasn't a prank, it was thorough." Tomato, tomato. They began working. The rhythm of it was irritatingly smooth. Kaworu didn't pretend to lead or provoke, just offered a steady stream of decent ideas, most of them sharpened at the edges with enough wit to make Renji have to suppress a smirk. Occasionally, Kaworu would glance up and tilt his head, waiting for Renji's response to something said in passing, and every time he did, Renji's stomach twisted slightly with the discomfort of being read. He hated it, and hated even more how seamless it became. At some point, Kaworu climbed up onto the couch beside him, claiming it was easier to see the screen. They sat shoulder to shoulder, Mochi now squished between them, purring like a small engine. Renji typed, Kaworu scrolled, their arguments blurring into something dangerously collaborative. Once their fingers brushed when reaching for the same sticky note. Renji froze, tensed like he'd been shocked. Kaworu didn't move, he stayed close, as if Renji hadn't flinched at all. A jazz trumpet wailed softly in the background, as silence stretched between them. Not awkward, not exactly comfortable either. Charged, that was the word. The kind of tension that hung in the air before a thunderstorm, or the final act of a shoujo anime, when the characters still hadn't figured out they were falling into something dangerous. Renji glanced up, desperate for distraction, and his eyes caught on the mirror across the room. He stared. In the mirror the two of them were laughing, quiet, intimate laughter, like something had just been said that only the two of them would understand. Renji frowned. They weren't laughing, not really, not in real life, but the reflection had a life of its own, easy, unguarded. It didn't make sense. He blinked, and the image was gone. Just two figures on a couch, bathed in lamp glow. Kaworu leaning over him, reading a paragraph off his laptop screen, one hand resting too close to Renji's. Mochi, snoring. Renji swallowed, trying to push away the chill that slid down his back. Kaworu looked up and caught him staring. You okay? I'm fine. Your expression says otherwise. You look like you've seen a ghost. No, Renji muttered. Worse. Kaworu raised an eyebrow. Worse than a ghost. Renji didn't answer. He went back to typing, eyes locked on the document. Kaworu leaned back again, but not far enough. The weight of him, the warmth, the ease with which he navigated this strange domesticity, it was suffocating. Renji wasn't prepared for this. He had armed himself for sharp glares and passive-aggressive notes in the margins, for smug competition and biting commentary. Not this strange, off-balance atmosphere, where Kaworu smelled like orange tea and spoke in quiet tones that almost passed for kindness. Not this version of Kaworu, who made space for him, whose home had warmth, who sat next to him, like he belonged there. And now, as they both reached for the same page of notes again, fingers colliding, again, Renji flinched harder than necessary, and dropped the paper. It floated to the floor like a white flag of surrender. Kaworu stared at him, silent. Renji didn't move. He could feel his ears burning. Do I make you nervous? Kaworu asked, not with cruelty, but with a genuine curiosity that made it infinitely worse. No, Renji snapped, far too quickly. Kaworu leaned in slightly, his voice lowering, just enough for Renji to catch it like a thread. You act like I do. Renji clenched his jaw, and focused on Mochi, who was still dead asleep between them, as if the room wasn't thick with something impossible. Kaworu didn't laugh. That made it worse. It was so much worse. He wasn't teasing. He was just there, close, unmoving. Renji stood up abruptly. I should go. Kaworu blinked up at him. We're not done. We'll finish it later. Mochi meowed softly in protest. Kaworu tilted his head. You sure? Renji grabbed his bag. Yes. Kaworu didn't argue. He just sat back, arms draped across the back of the couch, watching Renji, like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he'd planned it. Text me, Kaworu said casually. I'll leave a seat open at the crypt. Renji didn't respond. He closed the door too fast on the way out. The sound echoed down the hallway, like an accusation. He kept walking, but the image of the mirror, of them laughing, shoulder to shoulder, followed him the entire way home. Renji had just opened his laptop when he noticed the unread messages waiting for him. 4 new notifications, 2 missed calls, a tagged video. He blinked, clicked. It was TikTok. He didn't use TikTok. He didn't have a TikTok, but someone had tagged him in one, and the thumbnail was already enough to make his stomach clench. A paused frame of him, mid-sip from a coffee cup, his head turned slightly. Kaworu blurred in the background, but unmistakable, relaxed, leaning back in a hoodie, laughing at something just out of frame. The video began to play before Renji could brace for it. Soft lo-fi music faded in. A voiceover whispered, "When the soulmates don't know they're soulmates." The first clip was from campus, shot from a distance. Kaworu in a black hoodie, leaning against a bike rack, looking around lazily. Renji approached, said something indistinct, and Kaworu lit up. The frame froze just as Kaworu smiled in a way that looked far too genuine. Renji groaned. The next clip was from the library, clearly recorded from behind a shelf, and the camera slowly zoomed in on the two of them sitting side by side, sharing a laptop screen. Kaworu elbowed Renji. Renji elbowed back. They smirked. Kaworu laughed. Renji didn't, but in that moment, his face looked softer. Then came a quick succession of hoodie moments. Renji handing Kaworu a coffee cup. Kaworu flicking a pen against Renji's forehead. Renji rolling his eyes so hard it was practically audible, but Kaworu just smiled, that lazy grin, like he knew everything Renji was going to say before he said it. The video cut to a still frame, the two of them in the mirror, side by side on Kaworu's couch. That moment, the one Renji had never spoken about, the one he still wasn't sure he'd really seen, but it was there, perfectly captured. They were laughing in the mirror, shoulder to shoulder, Kaworu's arms stretched along the couch back, relaxed like they'd known each other for years. They hadn't been laughing in real life, but the mirror remembered differently. A final clip, Mochi sitting on a laptop keyboard, tail flicking. The screen blinked, upload complete. The video ended with slow text across a black screen. Just get married already. #academic, husbands, #soul bonded, #Kaworu's, #Mochi knows Renji didn't realize how tightly he was gripping the edge of the desk until the laptop creaked beneath his palms. His phone buzzed. Kaworu, I was tagged in it 7 times. Renji stared at the message. He didn't reply. Kaworu, again, 8. Now, Mochi might have posted it herself. I had the laptop open. She stepped on it. Renji, she didn't step on it. She uploaded a 30-second edited highlight reel of us like a dating documentary. Kaworu, she's gifted. Gets it from me. Renji, this is humiliating. Kaworu, is it though? You looked good. That library shot. Your side profile, strong. Renji, we're not married. He hit send too fast. Regretted it immediately. The typing dots appeared, paused, disappeared, then came back. Kaworu, yet. Renji dropped his phone onto the desk like it burned. He sat there, fuming silently, knowing full well that Kaworu was somewhere watching all of this unfold with that same unbearable smirk, the one that made him want to throw a textbook across the room, or himself. He hadn't even seen Kaworu in person since their last study session, the one where their fingers had touched, and Renji had left like the room was on fire. He told himself he wasn't avoiding Kaworu, that he'd just been busy, which made it all the worse when he walked into class the next morning, and a group of students burst into spontaneous applause. One girl held up her phone. The video, playing, volume off, but the captions clear. When the soulmates don't know their soulmates. Kaworu was already in his seat, feet up, hood pulled low, unbothered. He pulled out a coffee from his bag, Renji's usual order, set it down on the desk beside him. Without looking, Renji froze. One of the students called out, "Where's your husband?" Kaworu answered smoothly, "Right here. He just doesn't know it yet." Renji nearly dropped his bag. The professor walked in before he could formulate a rebuttal, but the damage was already done. The title, "The Husbands," was no longer a joke. It was becoming prophecy. By the end of the class, 2 students had asked him for advice on how to make your academic soulmate fall in love with you. One had said it unironically. Kaworu didn't help. He just leaned in closer every time. Renji tried to create distance. Passed notes during lecture that said things like, "Your typing speed is impressive, almost as fast as your denial." At lunch, Renji tried to hide behind a vending machine. Kaworu found him anyway. "You saw the video, huh?" he said, handing over a sandwich, like it was completely normal. "You know I did. You were tagged, too." "I counted." Renji glared. "This is your fault." "My fault. Mochi's the one with the editing software. You encourage this." "I didn't tell her to sync it to music." "You were not." Renji stopped, flustered beyond rational speech. "It's wrong. It's misleading." Kaworu leaned casually against the wall beside him, unbothered as always. "You think the mirror lied?" Renji turned red. Kaworu grinned, leaned in just a little. "She picked our best angles." Renji looked away, mortified, mouth set in a thin line. "It's humiliating." Kaworu tilted his head. "Only if you think being wanted is embarrassing." "I'm not. You keep saying that. Not married. Not interested. Not. But your face turns pink every time someone says soulmate. Kind of suspicious." Renji had no words. He gripped his bag strap like a lifeline, and walked off, sandwich untouched. Kaworu let him go. Didn't follow, just smiled, because by the time Renji reached the next building, his phone buzzed again. Another tag, another remix. Mochi stepping on a keyboard. Kaworu stealing glances when Renji wasn't looking. Renji
Looking back, the caption, "He says they're not married. His eyes say otherwise." Renji closed the app, closed his eyes, and cursed under his breath. Mochi knew, and worst of all, she wasn't wrong. The conference check-in desk buzzed with quiet chaos, attendees chatting, bags rolling, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Renji adjusted the strap of his backpack, and stepped forward, when the receptionist waved him over. "Name?" she asked, too cheery for someone who clearly hadn't slept. "Kazuki, Renji Kazuki." The click of her keyboard was too long, then her eyes flicked to the side, lips pressed in the universal expression of something went wrong. "We have you in the honeymoon suite." Renji blinked. "What?" She nodded. "Reserved for two, under your department's name. It's the only room they pre-booked under the shared delegate account." "I think it was." She glanced at the file. A Dr. Kanamura's instructions. Renji knew that name. Their advisor. He hated that he knew that name. Kaworu appeared behind him like summoned mischief. "Ah, room stuff." Renji didn't even turn. "Don't say anything." Kaworu leaned his elbows casually on the counter. "Too late. I already heard." "Honeymoon suite." The receptionist smiled apologetically. "It has a king-size bed, a whirlpool tub, and complimentary chocolates." Kaworu grinned. "Well, I do like chocolates." Renji buried his face in one hand. "Is there another room?" "Any room. We're completely booked. All the delegates arrived early for the keynote this afternoon. There might be availability tomorrow." Kaworu plucked the keycard from the counter. "We'll survive. It's a mattress, not a marriage license." Renji didn't respond. His soul was already ascending out of his body in protest. Their walk to the elevator was mostly silent, except for Kaworu casually commenting on the carpet pattern, like they weren't on their way to a room explicitly designed for romantic escapades. When they reached the suite, Renji's hope deflated entirely. The room looked like the inside of a romance novel. There were rose decals printed into the wallpaper. The king-size bed was layered in a cascade of red and cream pillows. The whirlpool tub was literally in view from the bed, separated only by a half wall with etched glass. On the nightstand sat a heart-shaped box of chocolates, unopened. A swan towel formation watched them from the corner of the bed, like a smug bird prophet. Kaworu dropped his bag by the sofa. "Wow, this room is aggressively committed to a narrative." Renji stood stiff in the doorway. "I'm not sleeping here. Where would you like to go?" "The hallway." Renji's eyes scanned the room for a spare couch, a cot, anything. "I'll sleep in the tub." Kaworu flopped back onto the mattress. It creaked gently under the weight. "You're being dramatic." Renji turned. "You're not even trying to pretend this is normal." Kaworu folded his hands behind his head. "Why would I? This is clearly the universe's idea of a slow burn. You've seen the TikTok. Don't bring up the TikTok." Kaworu sat up and patted the bed. "Just pick a side. There's plenty of room between us for denial." Renji, muttering, dropped his bag, and stood there frozen for a full minute, before reluctantly sitting at the edge of the bed, as far from Kaworu as physically possible, without falling off. He refused to take off his shoes. Kaworu had already stretched out like a cat in sunbeams. The air conditioner hummed softly. Outside the balcony doors, the city buzzed. The bed felt unnervingly soft. Kaworu, without opening his eyes, said, "Stop looking at me like that." "I'm not." "You are. Like I orchestrated this. Do you think I called the hotel in advance and requested romantic entrapment for two, with academic overtones?" Renji rolled his eyes. "You would say that. It's not a trap," Kaworu said, flipping onto his side. "It's just logistics, spatial inconvenience, platonic bed proximity." Renji laid back stiffly, arms at his sides. "You're enjoying this?" Kaworu didn't answer. They lay back to back, inches of awkward space between them. The room dimmed as the sun dropped below the skyline. Renji watched the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take someone, anyone, so the tension might break. Instead, time stretched. Minutes passed in silence, their breathing slowly sinking by accident, the soft weight of exhaustion settling in, despite every internal protest. Eventually, Renji closed his eyes. In the stillness of the room, in the dim gold of the bedside lamp, left on like a peace offering, a single cherry blossom petal floated gently down from nowhere. It landed on the pillow. Between them, there was no cherry tree. It wasn't even spring. No breeze, just a petal, soft, pink, inexplicable. And Mochi wasn't even there. When morning came, Renji woke up to warmth, pressed against his back, an arm draped over his side, legs tangled with his, a hand resting exactly where it should not be. He didn't move. The realization hit like a thunderclap. He was wrapped in Kaworu's limbs, like some failed game of academic twister. One of Kaworu's legs was caught behind his knee, his arm pinned. They had somehow drifted, turned, merged like two magnets that had given up fighting polarity overnight. His breath caught. Kaworu stirred behind him. Hmm? Renji didn't answer, couldn't. Every cell in his body had entered a state of riot. Kaworu mumbled, voice low and muffled by the pillow. Morning, darling. Renji shot upright so fast, he nearly launched himself off the bed. Kaworu blinked up at him, hair mussed, one eye open. What? You arms. Renji sputtered, gesturing, like his limbs couldn't be trusted to explain themselves. Kaworu yawned. Relax, I toss in my sleep. You latched onto me. I'm a very affectionate sleeper. We are not affectionate anything. Kaworu sat up slowly, ran a hand through his hair. Well, we shared a pillow. That's halfway to marriage in some cultures. Renji stared at him. Absolutely, completely undone. Kaworu smiled, the picture of early morning calm. I'll order breakfast. As he rose and padded barefoot to the suite's phone, Renji noticed something else. The cherry blossom petal still on the pillow, exactly between where they'd slept. Renji picked it up, stared at it like it might explode. Outside, traffic moved as usual, the day beginning like any other, but the room still felt like it belonged to another kind of story. He looked at Kaworu, who was ordering eggs, like none of this mattered. Renji whispered under his breath, "This is a nightmare." But the universe didn't answer, only the petal remained.
The conference day blurred in Renji's mind. Panels, networking, awkward small talk over lukewarm coffee, none of it registered clearly. What did stay with him was a voice, low and familiar, drifting from behind the hotel partition wall of the courtyard. He hadn't meant to stop. He hadn't even meant to hear anything. But he did. Kaworu was leaning against a column, talking to one of the adjuncts from another university, someone Renji recognized but didn't know by name. The two of them stood under a hanging light, half glowing in the dusk. "He's not easy to work with, huh?" the adjunct said, trying to joke. Kaworu chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's particular." Renji bristled from behind the partition. Typical, always making jokes at his expense. But Kaworu's tone shifted. "He's brilliant," he said quietly, "and terrifying when he's focused. He notices everything, even things I try not to show." There was a pause. The other man said something, low and indistinct, something about rivalry, maybe teasing. Kaworu answered, his voice softer than Renji had ever heard it. "It's hard to hate someone who looks at you like you're home." The words hit Renji like ice down his spine. He backed away. He didn't stay to hear the rest, didn't want to, couldn't. His chest felt too tight, like there were wires being pulled inside him, crossing, snapping, reconfiguring. He left the courtyard and walked until he didn't know where he was anymore, and even when he made it back to his room, the words followed. "It's hard to hate someone who looks at you like you're home." He paced, didn't eat, didn't respond to messages. He stared at his laptop screen for hours, rereading the same paragraph until the words lost shape. His brain felt like it was chewing itself into knots. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to feel. Anger? Validation? A sick, crawling sense of hope? By the time the knock came, it was nearly 10 p.m. He hesitated before answering. Kaworu stood in the hallway, a paper bag in one hand, and a thermos in the other. His hair was a mess from the wind. There were circles under his eyes. "I brought soup," he said. Renji didn't move. Kaworu added, quieter, "You missed dinner." Renji opened the door wider. He wasn't sure why, just knew that every part of him wanted to slam it shut, and also never let Kaworu leave again. Kaworu stepped in, miso, from the place down the street. "It's not bad." He placed the bag on the low coffee table, then stood awkwardly, not meeting Renji's eyes. He began then stopped. "I'm not here to bother you. I just thought, maybe you didn't want to be alone." Renji looked at him for a long time, longer than he meant to, then said, I overheard you. Kaworu's shoulders tensed, barely perceptible. When? This afternoon. Courtyard. Kaworu didn't ask what Renji heard, he just nodded slowly, lips pressing into a thin line. Renji didn't know what he was supposed to say, so instead, he walked to the couch and sat. Kaworu followed a moment later, lowering himself onto the cushions with an exhausted sigh. The soup sat untouched. The silence stretched. I'm scared, Renji said suddenly, his voice barely audible. Kaworu turned toward him, not all the way, just enough that their shoulders touched. I know, Renji didn't look at him. Kaworu's voice was careful, but I'm not playing a game. Renji closed his eyes. Everything inside him was brittle. He didn't trust this, didn't trust himself, but he didn't move away either. They sat there, not speaking. The space between them was quiet but not empty. There was tension, yes, but not the kind that begged for confrontation. It was the kind that hovered, like steam above a cooling cup. The kind that said too much had already been said without saying it aloud. Their shoulders pressed lightly together, their hands didn't touch. And then, from the hallway, a soft thump. Both of them looked down. Mochi had appeared. No one had brought her in. She padded into the room like a queen, who owned the floor, tail high, chin raised. Between her teeth, she carried a narrow piece of paper. She dropped it at their feet, sat, and stared with unmistakable judgment. Renji picked it up. It was handmade washi, inked with perfect brush strokes, unmistakable in their clarity. Confess already, idiots. Renji stared at it in horror. Kaworu laughed, not loudly, just a soft, breathy sound, more real than any of his usual smirks. She has a flair for the dramatic, he said. Renji pressed the note to his chest like it might erase itself if he held it tight enough. I hate you. Kaworu bumped his shoulder. Liar. Renji didn't respond. He stared at the paper. Kaworu didn't move away. Neither of them reached for the soup. It sat there, cooling. Mochi stretched, yawned, and curled herself between them, purring. Renji still didn't look at Kaworu. Kaworu didn't look away. The room remained like that for a long time, still, thick with unspoken words, but they didn't need to say them yet. Not tonight, not while they were finally sitting still, together, touching, barely, with calligraphy at their feet and a smug cat between them. The silence wasn't just silence anymore, it was an answer. The auditorium lights dimmed as the last slide of their thesis presentation faded out. Applause broke like a wave, first polite, then building. Professors nodded, students whispered, someone clapped too hard, and let out a low whistle that made Renji's ears burn. The panel chair, an uncharacteristically warm adjunct, who once called Renji the caffeinated hurricane, stood up and offered a rare smile, brilliantly argued, balanced, sharp, layered, she said. The soulmates do it again. More applause. Renji felt his heart thundering, not just from the relief of surviving the presentation, but from the impossible sense of something ending, something that had started the moment their names were read out on the first day of the semester, and never slowed down. Beside him, Kaworu leaned forward slightly, and whispered, we're ridiculous, the bar's too high now. Everyone else after this is going to look like a sad PowerPoint. Renji rolled his eyes, but he couldn't suppress the smile that tugged at the edge of his mouth. His hands were still trembling, but not from nerves, not anymore. Kaworu's calm was infectious. He always had that effect. The ability to make disaster seem like a minor inconvenience, and victory feel like an inside joke. They bowed briefly, and stepped down from the stage. People clapped them on the shoulder, congratulated them, nodded as they passed. Some said, the husbands again. One whispered academic royalty, under their breath. It was too much, all of it. Renji made a beeline for the courtyard. He needed air. The sky had darkened to deep blue, stars blinking into focus above the campus bell tower. The courtyard was quiet, a few students milling about, most of them already inside celebrating. Kaworu followed him outside, naturally. Of course he did. He never stayed where people expected him to be. That was Kaworu, always a few steps off the map. You okay? He asked softly. I don't know what to do with all of this praise, Renji said. It feels like a setup. Kaworu shrugged. You get used to it. Renji sat down on one of the low stone benches, and stared up at the sky. The stars flickered overhead. The air smelled like grass and winter and old stone. Kaworu sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Kaworu reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, twisted wire, silver and thin, looped delicately into a rough circle. He held it out in his palm. The moonlight caught on it. "I made you something," he said, a little too quickly, like he was embarrassed. Renji blinked. "Is that notebook wire?" Kaworu confirmed. "From my thesis notebook, the one you kept stealing." "I didn't steal it. You borrowed it permanently." Renji stared at the makeshift ring, simple and imperfect and clearly crafted with far more care than Kaworu was letting on. Kaworu cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "It's not forever," he said. "Just until we graduate." Renji's chest twisted. He took the ring slowly, holding it in his palm like it might break. The wire was warm from Kaworu's hand, coiled with a little knot where the loop connected, a detail he hadn't needed to add, but did anyway. Renji slipped it onto his finger. Its voice caught. "I love it." Kaworu was watching him, expression unreadable. Renji met his gaze, and finally stopped pretending. "And I love you." The words were terrifying to say. They sounded like a secret finally coming up for air. Kaworu didn't smirk, didn't joke, didn't make a quip about soulmates or TikTok captions. He leaned in, slowly. No game, no script, just gravity. Renji didn't pull away. Their foreheads touched first, then gently, deliberately, their lips met, exactly as they did. A star shot across the sky, bright and silent, and fast, a line of light carving through the dark above them. The kind of star you only ever see in the last frame of a perfect scene, as if the universe had been holding its breath for the exact moment they stopped running. The kiss wasn't perfect, it wasn't choreographed, it didn't last too long, but it was honest, and when they pulled apart, neither of them looked away. Renji's voice was quiet. "Is this what it feels like to not be afraid?" Kaworu smiled. "No, it still feels terrifying." They sat together, shoulders touching, heads tilted back, watching the stars above the university courtyard. The ring on Renji's finger glinted softly, with every breath. Behind them, in the shadows, Mochi sat on the stone railing. She blinked once, slow and satisfied, then nodded. Wisely. The apartment was too small. That was Renji's first thought, when the door clicked shut behind them, and the reality of post-grad life settled in. The boxes barely fit. The bookshelves Kaworu insisted on bringing lined every available wall, even the space between the tiny kitchen window and the microwave. There was a teetering stack of academic journals beside the bathroom door. Every surface hosted a mug, or a tea tin. The floor creaked when Mochi walked, which she did with great ceremony, tail high, as if inspecting the kingdom she clearly owned. "This is a hazard zone," Renji muttered, kicking aside a stray box labeled "Lit Thisari Throw Away Never" in Kaworu's handwriting. Kaworu set a kettle on the stove. "It's cozy. It's a shoebox. It's our shoebox." Renji groaned, but didn't argue. The place did feel oddly warm, lived in, even before the furniture was unpacked. Maybe it was the sunlight streaming through the crooked blinds. Maybe it was the fact that, despite the cramped quarters, everything had found its place with uncanny efficiency. Renji's side of the bookshelf was already alphabetized. Kaworu's was arranged by vibe. The couch was completely lost to Mochi, who had claimed it before the movers left. She sat in the center, regal and immovable, like she'd always been waiting for this final arrangement. They worked quietly, falling into rhythm the way they always did, moving boxes, adjusting frames, arguing softly over whether the toaster should live in the kitchen, or in Kaworu's suspiciously titled snack nook. It was Renji who noticed the notification first. His phone buzzed once, then again, then 4 times, in rapid succession. He opened it with dread. A TikTok. The thumbnail was him, hood over his head, sulking under a blanket. The title in cursive overlay read, "From Rivals to Soulmates." The husbands were real all along then. Renji's heart dropped. He hit play. The video opened with a blurry clip from their first class presentation, the very first one, back when Kaworu had leaned over and called him partner, with that unbearable smirk. The soft purple flash bloomed briefly on screen, like a glitch in time. The music swelled. The next clips flew by in a montage.
Study sessions, coffee breaks, their infamous mirror moment, footage from the academic conference, the shared glance, the cherry blossom petal on the pillow, the scene of Kaworu handing Renji the notebook wire ring, Renji putting it on with shaking fingers, then the thesis applause, their kiss under the stars, and finally, a new shot. Someone had filmed them moving into the apartment, probably the neighbor, Kaworu carrying boxes, Renji arguing about where the desk should go, Mochi perched in the window. It ended with the camera, zoomed in through the glass as Renji, wrapped in a blanket, sat cross-legged on the floor, sipping tea while Kaworu poured more hot water with exaggerated flair. The husbands. They made it. Renji tossed his phone onto the rug like it had betrayed him. Kaworu looked up from the kitchen. You saw it. I'm under a blanket, and they still filmed me. It's trending, Kaworu said. Again. Renji grumbled and pulled the blanket over his head. Stop calling me your husband. Kaworu wandered over, tea in hand, and nudged his sock-covered foot with his own. Then marry me, and I'll stop. Renji peeked out from under the blanket, face flushed. Shut up, husband. Kaworu grinned. Love it when you say that. Renji buried himself deeper into the blanket cave, defeated but secretly glowing beneath the cotton walls. The evening settled into soft domestic chaos. Kaworu brewed tea in 3 pots at once. For variety, he claimed. Renji reorganized the spice shelf out of sheer anxiety. Mochi swatted a coaster off the counter for attention. They didn't unpack everything. They didn't need to. The essentials were already there. Books, tea, and the unspoken ease of having fought their way to this point, and somehow come out whole. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the buildings, Renji stepped out onto the tiny balcony for air. The city breathed around them, lights in the distance, cars passing below. He leaned on the railing, the wire ring still snug on his finger. A soft sound made him glance down. Mochi. She was sitting beside the potted plant. Kaworu called the unkillable basil. Around her neck was a small cloth badge, stitched with golden thread. Love spirit. Rank S. Renji stared, then looked at Kaworu through the window. Kaworu just winked. Mochi turned her head slowly, meeting Renji's gaze. Then the camera, because of course there was a camera. Somewhere. Always. Maybe not real, but real enough. She winked. A single blink. Then sat perfectly still, tail curled around her paws like punctuation at the end of a story. Somewhere in the apartment, the credits rolled.